Welcome to the second lesson in our first book of Kings. We're covering chapters 3 and 4 today, the early reign of King Solomon. Today we'll take an overview of Solomon's rule, and we'll take a look at the third verse of Kings. Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David, except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at the local places of worship. The most important of these places of worship was Gibeon. Now, this passage, I've highlighted a couple of things here. This passage will give us a clue to some of the failings that are going to happen within King Solomon's rule. Despite all his glory and all his accomplishments, we know that every human being, king or not, does have some downsides. So let's look at the except here. Continuing on, it was peculiar that Solomon should seek to worship at the high places that are outside of the city of Jerusalem. And at this particular one in Gibeon, because the Ark of the Covenant, which is the symbol of the Lord's presence, was inside Jerusalem, inside the tent of meeting. The center of Israel's worship was always to be in Jerusalem once David had established it as the capital. Even though there wasn't a temple yet or a tabernacle, the city was the main focus for worship. David had brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem, and it was housed there in a tent. And there were other high sites throughout Israel too, besides Gibeon. And the thing is, though, that the king should be setting an example and making offerings in Jerusalem. So while he's at Gibeon, making his multiple offerings, Solomon has a dream. And in that dream, this is what is happening. That night, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart, such as no one else has had or ever will have. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and my commands as your father David did, I will give you a long life." So Solomon woke up and he realized that this had been a dream. And he returned to Jerusalem and he stood before the Ark of the Lord's covenant, where he sacrificed more burnt offerings and peace offerings. And then a celebration. He invited all his officials to a great banquet. So it's interesting, I think, that he went back to Jerusalem and again offered offerings in the place where he probably should have done so in the first place. Just my comment. Okay. So if we analyze Solomon's dream according to cultures of the period of time in the Middle East and the Near East, Solomon's request is viewed really as part of an ancient Near Eastern royal coronation ritual, where the king is given the privilege of a special petition to the deity. And there are some psalms written as these types of requests. And I'm going to share with you Psalm 20. which is an example of a Near Eastern royal coronation ritual. In Psalm 20, verse 1, in times of trouble, may the Lord answer your cry. May the name of God of Jacob keep you safe from all harm. May he send you help from his sanctuary and strengthen you from Jerusalem. May he remember all your gifts and look favorably on your burnt offerings. And may he grant your heart's desires and make all your plans succeed. May we shout for joy when we hear of your victory and raise a victory banner in the name of our God. May the Lord answer all your prayers. Now I know the Lord rescues his anointed king. He will answer him from his holy heaven and rescue him by his great power. Some nations boast of their chariots and horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God. Those nations will fall down and collapse, but we will rise up and stand firm. Give victory to our King, O Lord. Answer our cry for help. I think this psalm is a really good example of asking for the coverage of the king by God. In other words, for the Lord to protect and ensure the reign of this particular king, whomever it may be. It says it was written by David, so he may have written it for his own coronation. Don't know. We don't know. But it is part of a normal ritual of establishing a new king in the Near East. So Solomon was, through the methods of palace intrigue and the works of Nathan and Bathsheba, established as the king. He may have been quite young, probably fairly young. And so this is something that frequently happened is someone would overthrow a king and then they would establish a young person, a child even sometimes, into the role of king, where other people were actually supporting the youth and making decisions. And this may have happened with Solomon. He was probably still fairly young and being influenced by his courtiers. So this is a common reference in ancient Near Eastern propaganda that kings, especially those who come to a throne at a very young age, will call attention to God's election and purpose in spite of their youth, saying that they are the king, they are the anointed and designated ruler. So this original dream account that Solomon had may actually have been part of a political system where you use some propaganda to make it legitimate that this person is the rightful heir to the throne. And as we know, this could easily have happened with Solomon, since he did have an older brother who had the primary right to be the next king, according to the rules of primogeniture. So in 1 Kings 3, we'll go back again to the beginning of this chapter. It starts out interestingly talking about Solomon taking a princess into his kingdom. So, and it says Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he married one of his daughters, and he brought her to live in the city of David until he could finish building his palace and the temple of the Lord and the wall around the city. So he's made some kind of an alliance with the king of Pharaoh. and in return received a princess. Now, this is interesting because of a lot of things we'll take a look at here. First of all, Israel had been warned by God not to look back to the ways of Egypt. In the first verses of Kings 3, we see that Solomon made this alliance with Egypt and he brought a royal princess to his kingdom. And what should we make of that action? Was this princess going to be his main wife, the queen? Because Solomon, it says, one of his first things that he did was to build a palace for her. But if we look closely, we see that it's a diplomatic deal and sealed by Egypt's succession of the newly conquered city of Gezer to Solomon as part of the dowry with the princess, according to the notation that we'll see later in chapter 9, verse 16. Politically, the marriage signaled that Solomon was rising in prominence in the international arena. His rule is being recognized by surrounding nations. He's leading his tiny new nation into the realm of world-class diplomacy. And the rulers of the powerful empire of Egypt had to come to terms with him, even to giving the Egyptian princess to him. And that was remarkable because, according to one of the Amarna letters, the Egyptians did not like to make such concessions on their part. And engraved in the clay stone of the Amarna letters is this particular statement from Egypt. It said, "From time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone." So this is an unusual arrangement that Solomon would actually receive as a wife, a gift of a princess from Egypt. Now, what about Solomon's priorities? It seems like maybe he had some self-interest above some of the priorities that might have been better well chosen. First of all, Solomon was very slow to build the temple and the defenses around the city because he was more interested in the marriage to the Egyptian princess and in building the palaces for himself and his new princess queen. And then we look overall at what Solomon is doing, starting off of his reign. This episode of the marriage brings to mind a lot of warnings that had been issued prior to the people of Israel. So if we view this marriage against the backdrop of our Deuteronomic prohibition against marriages to foreigners, we will see that such alliances would cause people to turn away from following the Lord, and consequently, they would lead to some destruction. There's lots of commentary or references in the Bible to and warnings to not intermarry. And even for the kings, this would be considered. So there's in Deuteronomy 7 and Joshua 23 and 2 Kings 8. But one of the ones that we had looked at extensively in the past is the one from Deuteronomy chapter 17. And this is Moses who is talking, and Moses who is giving instructions in some of his final speeches to the people before they go into Canaan. And Moses, out of the mouth of Moses, it says that the king must not cause the people to return to Egypt. And all the other references to be separate from the nation's gods and kings where they are going to be living in the future. But looking back to the ways of Egypt doesn't just only mean to go physically back to Egypt to live. That's not likely to happen. But what it does mean is not to return to the ways of life that you had back in Egypt, and particularly not to return to polytheism, which is the worship of multiple gods and other gods besides the one God, Yahweh. And so we see that this is something that Israel continued to struggle with. And even the leaders who would be setting examples like David and Solomon and the future kings struggled with this. So this is something that we read back in Deuteronomy 17 that's quite explicit. This is what Moses was saying. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses. For the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. And the king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. When we think of the reign of King Solomon, one of the things that comes to mind is always the great wealth that he had and the great building projects that he had and so on. So we see that this is an ancient warning against doing this, but yet the ways of power, it's apparently was no different then as it is now, that once you have power, wealth, and a little greed seems to come right along in the door with the power. And it goes on to describe further in Kings 9 when we get there. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, the royal palace, the supporting terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, the cities of Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. And Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had attacked and captured Gezer, killing the Canaanite population and burning it down. He gave the city to his daughter as a wedding gift when she married Solomon. And so Solomon rebuilt the city of Gezer. So there's how the connection is between the Pharaoh, the princess, and this particular building project. So I mentioned the letters of Amarna earlier. This is a group of clay tablets that were discovered in Egypt, and they date back to around the 14th century BCE. Even though they're incomplete, they're interesting in giving insight to the nature of diplomatic relations among the great nations and the petty states of the Mesopotamian area. We know there were many little kingdoms, and so Egypt was always pretty powerful for the most part, and would have agreements with these various other smaller kingdoms. So we can gain some insight from some of the cuneiform type inscriptions that are on these letters in clay. And this is a description of them. They are written in archaic and somewhat provincialized form of cuneiform, Babylonian style cuneiform. The tablets represent part of a correspondence between the Egyptian court and other states and vassals of the ancient Middle East. Letters from the great powers of Babylonia, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites are, that's some of the ones that are included. So the powers are preoccupied with the exchange of gifts and diplomatic marriages. Those from the vassal states of Syro-Palestine, in other words, Syria or Assyria and Palestine, deal with local political and military situations and are often filled with complaints of inattention on the part of the Egyptian court. The tablets that have been preserved in various museums are around the world, the majority of them can be seen in Berlin, London, and Cairo. That's pretty cool. So here's another picture of them. We'll go back and look. Cunea style writing. So one of the most famous stories about King Solomon is the story where he decides which woman is the correct mother for the infant. Both mothers claim this is their child, and King Solomon is presented with this problem and should make a decision who gets the infant. This is probably a tall tale, kind of reminding us of David and Goliath. It is a story to kind of point out how great King Solomon's wisdom was. But it's interesting, as I checked it out, that there are other stories that are very similar to this particular story about the two women. And so here's a little bit of a background here. The tale of two women are seeking some justice. The king in this story that is mentioned, he is never given a name, and neither are the two women. And in support of this view, it's often pointed out that there are folkloristic elements in the narrative and the parallels of stories found in other cultures in the Levant, meaning the area of Israel, and as far away as India and Eastern Asia. So could this really be another folk tale, sort of like David and Goliath? Here's a painting made in the 1800s, an engraving, and then later it was colored over, of King Solomon's judgment. Even in the picture, you can see Solomon is looking like he's young. He doesn't have a full beard like is normally an adult male. So the two women, and it's interesting to me that they are not named and they are prostitutes, which, is kind of another way of saying it's people not of value. But then there was another interesting comparison that was brought up in the commentaries that I thought I would share with you. And it said that this story may be compared to another famous Old Testament story involving the life of another beloved son, and that is Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac back in Genesis 22. In that story, the father is also willing to give up his son. In this case, though, it was in obedience to God. And like the unnamed living son of the unnamed mother, the life of Abraham's son Isaac, too, is hanging in the balance as Abraham prepares to sacrifice him in order to be faithful to God. Yet, because Abraham is willing to give up the son whom he loves, he receives the boy back as a gift, and in obedience, he was willing to surrender his beloved son. And so the prostitute whose son it was willing to give him up in order to save his life as well. So in Solomon's administration, a little bit more of an overview, we read in verses 2-6 that most likely you'll recognize some of these names of people in his administration because they are carrying over from the rule of David to Solomon. So in the transition, they are still effectively part of Solomon's administration. And then we have another little description of how Solomon fared here. In 1 Kings chapter 4, it says, "The people of Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand on the seashore. they were very contented with plenty to eat and drink. And Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River in the north to the land of the Philistines and the border of Egypt in the south. And the conquered people of these lands sent tribute money to Solomon and continued to serve him throughout his lifetime. So there's a little bit of an overview. Here are some of the people that are in his administration. And I've highlighted some that you might possibly recognize. Azariah, the son of Zadok, the priest. I am not sure how to pronounce some of these names, so just bear with me. Elirath and Ahijah, the sons of Shisha, were court secretaries. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was the commander of the army. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. Azariah, son of Nathan, was in charge of the governors. Zabud, son of Nathan, a priest, was the trusted advisor to the king. And Ashiar was manager of the palace property. And Adoniram, son of Abda, was in charge of the forced labor. Now that's, just part of the administration, but you can see there's the military section, there's the religious section, there is the governing of the property, but another thing that we see here that's like Egypt is that there is someone in charge of forced labor. So even though the people are all content throughout the land, supposedly we still have forced labor, and it makes me wonder if they were also really all that content. Now here's a map, and we see the numbers on here, the white circles with the numbers inside. These are the 12 different administrative districts that Solomon set up throughout the land. And we can see that he has a pretty big area, probably through here that he is governing. We see still that there's a separation of Moab, Ammon, Bashan. Some of these areas will recognize Beersheba from the way back in Genesis times, and Philistia, the land of the Philistines. This area right here later would be considered Phoenicia, up into here. And continuing on, God gave Solomon very great wisdom and understanding, and knowledge as vast as the sands of the seashore. In fact, his wisdom exceeded that of all the wise men of the East and the wise men of Egypt. He was wiser than anyone else, including Ethan and Ezrahite and the sons of Mahal, Haman, Kalkol, and Darda. His fame spread throughout all the surrounding nations. So we'll sing some of the praises of Solomon here. He composed some 3,000 proverbs and wrote 1,005 songs. He could speak with authority about all kinds of plants, from the great cedars of Lebanon to the tiny hyssop that grows from the cracks in the wall. He could also speak about animals, birds, small creatures, and fish. And kings from every nation sent their ambassadors to listen to the wisdom of Solomon. So he has quite a reputation throughout the lands around him, as well as in his own country. So it's evident then that Solomon is becoming a king that's just like the other kings in the region. This is precisely what some had warned would be the consequence of establishing a monarchy in Israel. The king might become just like all the other rulers in the region, demanding forced labor taxes for imperial expansions, and the maintenance of the court and the glorification of kings at the expense of the populace. Compared to Egypt, a strong and long-lived empire, the resemblance of Solomon's administration to other self-serving and oppressive regimes may be the very point of this passage back in Kings 4, verses 29 to 34. So let's take a look at some artifacts. This is of stone called a stele that was written in about the 9th century BCE, and it is for King Mesha of Moab. He set up the stele in his capital of Dibon. It shows or records the military victories over the King Mesha's enemies, including Israel and possibly Judah, which was called the House of David. It's unfortunate, though, that a portion of this stele that would mention King David of the Bible as the founder of Judah's dynasty had been damaged, which makes the reading of the House of David uncertain. So there is a reference, but there are pieces missing, and there's no thorough enough description to know for sure if it was actually Judah and King David. But we're still always looking for archaeological evidence. But as we discussed in the past, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence to support the life of King David. And this is another one, and it is the Tel Dan inscription, and it says, unfortunately, the recovered fragments of the House of David inscription do not preserve the names of specific kings involved in this encounter. It's a different one than the one we just looked at. But the most scholars believe that this stele recounts a campaign between Hazael of Damascus, in which he defeated Jeroboam of Israel and Ahijah of Judah. So the highlighted part over here is just a little bit of the inscription that has a reference that could possibly be linked to a campaign battle between Jeroboam and Ahijah. In other words, Israel and Judah combined together against the king of Damascus. Still very weak links historically as far as archaeological evidence. All right, so we're going to play the rest of the video that we had from last week and see what else our archaeologist has to tell us about the Rule of Solomon.
And that is the first temple, the temple built to house the Ark of the Covenant. As we saw, the Ark had been kept in a tabernacle, in a tent, on what may have been the highest point of the Jebusite city. Quite possibly, this had been a threshing floor where farmers used the prevailing winds to separate the kernels of grain from the chaff. In later decades, it would become known as Temple Mount, the location of the temple to Yahweh. The question was, however, what form should this temple take? Would it be inspired by Egyptian temples with their long actual projection of successive chambers? Or did Solomon's architects look for models closer to home? I think the answer is the latter. The design of the first temple largely followed the outlines of a typical megaron, a design that probably had its roots in the Greek culture of Mycenae, which we saw dominated much of the Near East until the 12th century. Now, essentially, the Megadon consisted of an entrance portal followed by a rectangular chamber, which then led to an inner chamber that contained the actual sanctuary and the cult statue of the god in question. It is this Megadon design that would lay the foundation some 300 years later for the development of the Greek temple, with a portal, a naos or nave, and a colonnade or peristyle running along the length of the structure. Early examples of the Megadon have also been found in Israel. A Canaanite temple built by King Javan during the time of the Israelite settlement was discovered by Yigal Yadin at Hazor. This temple, dedicated to the god Hadad, was also designed along an axis of a vestibule, central hall, and inner sanctum. And so, according to the Bible, King Solomon built the first temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. The first book of Kings even gives detailed specifications of this magnificent structure located on the temple platform now occupied by the Muslim monument known as the Dome of the Rock. The first temple also had a large rectangular nave or heikal flanked by lower aisles and was preceded by a ceremonial portal known as the ulam. At the very end of the nave was the inner sanctuary or debir, the Holy of Holies, which held the Ark. This temple was fronted by a spacious courtyard. Here, the king placed an altar for animal sacrifice and a huge bronze vessel that was known as the Sea of Bronze. This vessel rested on 12 bronze oxen, each group of 3 facing 4 points of the compass. Now, this magnificent work has obviously not survived, but an excavation project near Susa has found a very similar bronze basin from around 1500 BC. So the idea of a vessel borne by oxen must have been a common motif in the Middle East at that time. Excavations from the 1980s suggest that Solomon's architects may have built a prototype of sorts. And for that, we have to go to the Negev desert. Solomon's temple, as well as the second temple built after the Babylonian captivity, the one that Jesus visited, no longer exist. But we do have some shrines in Israel that give us an indication of what these temples might have looked like. One of these can be found in Arad, an Israelite outpost in the Negev desert. Here we can see the same key features that we would see in the Temple of Jerusalem, such as an area for an altar to perform sacrifices, an inner courtyard within the sanctuary, and a Holy of Holies. So while the Arad sanctuary is not as big as the temple, it does give us an idea of the development of this building type. And when it was finished, the Temple of Solomon was certainly an impressive achievement. With a length of 120 feet and a width of 55 feet, according to the measurements in the Bible, it was certainly not as big or impressive as the temples of Thebes or Nineveh. But by the standards of the young kingdom of Israel, it was magnificent, worthy to be called the dwelling place of the Lord. Unfortunately, nothing of Solomon's complex survives, not the precious stones and marble blocks, nor the countless vessels, furniture, and candelabra of cedar and wood. All of it was either looted or destroyed in the years since, culminating in the sack of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. But there may be one possible exception. You see, The first book of Kings tells us of a bronze laver stand, which had been commissioned by Solomon from the Phoenician artist Hiram. He reportedly made 10 stands of bronze, and each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze. Now, believe it or not, but Hiram was so proud of his work that we think he actually made 11 such stands, 10 to be shipped to Jerusalem and 1 to keep for himself, perhaps to show to other prospective clients. The reason is that this one bronze stand has actually survived, and now the British Museum has dated it to the time of Solomon. It was essentially a square cube on wheels with a round base on top. The 4 sides feature winged sphinxes, lions, and bulls, exactly as described in the first book of Kings. And so I think it's quite possibly the only major work of art from ancient Israel dating to the time of Solomon. Did Solomon actually have the funds to build such a temple complex? Well, the income from his gold mines would certainly indicate that he did. But, says the Bible, the king was keen to ensure that his people had a shared investment in the project. And so he appealed to the patriotism of his wealthier subjects by suggesting that they donate a generous portion of their income to the construction. And his citizens did not disappoint him. In all, Kings tells us Solomon raised 5,000 gold talents and 10,000 silver talents, which roughly is about 100 million in today's American currency. When it was completed, it was beyond a doubt the most impressive structure ever built in Canaan. Unfortunately, over the next 400 years, the temple was repeatedly plundered, first by Pharaoh Shishak or Shoshenq, then by King Jehoash of the northern kingdom, and even by King Ahaz of Judah, in order to finance the ransom that they needed to pay the Assyrian kings, like Tiglath-Pileser. And finally, as we saw, the temple was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Apart from building the temple, Solomon also created a huge harem. According to 1 Kings, that harem included 700 princesses and 300 concubines. Now, while these numbers are certainly exaggerated, it does appear that Solomon relied on intermarriage rather than military force to strengthen his ties with foreign kings as well as the rulers of the vassal states. If we could have taken a stroll through Solomon's harem, we would have found wives from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and other surrounding areas, as well as daughters from Israelite tribes. Solomon reportedly also protected his southern flank by marrying the daughter of Pharaoh, which could have been King Siamun of the 21st dynasty. During his long reign of nearly 20 years, Siamun was focused on rebuilding Tanis, the capital of the 21st dynasty, as we saw. That involved recycling much of the stones, decoration, and sculptures from Pyramessa, the city once built by the Israelites. And there was a reason why Siamun chose to do so, and that was that Upper Egypt was now firmly in the hands of the priests of Amun in Thebes, while the royal dynasty controlled Lower Egypt from their new capital in the Delta. So in a sense, Egypt was once again living through a split between North and South, between Lower and Upper Egypt, as in the days of the Hyksos kings. It's also rather remarkable, I think, that according to the Bible, Siamun sent his daughters to marry foreign kings. In earlier times, it was Pharaoh who married the daughters from foreign potentates, thus sealing their loyalty to the Egyptian crown. It shows that Egypt was once again in decline after the heyday of the New Kingdom. There is also a wonderful story about the Queen of Sheba. Her role in the biblical story of King Solomon is rather brief, but she would become the subject of many legends in Jewish and even Muslim literature. Historians, of course, debate whether the queen is a historical figure, but most agree that there was an ancient kingdom of Sheba or Saba in southern Arabia, and that its dynasty did include queens as well. According to 1 Kings, King Solomon came to the queen's attention because of his wealth and wisdom. And as we saw, the Bible tells us that Solomon's merchant ships often traveled along the Red Sea, possibly including the coast of Yemen, the region of the land of Sheba. But the queen was rather skeptical about all the stories that she had heard about Solomon. When the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, says 1 Kings, she came to test him with hard questions. The Quran, the scripture of Islam, develops this rivalry between the queen and Solomon further. According to one surah, Solomon was told by one of his counselors that he had found a woman ruling over all of them. She had been granted everything, and she has a mighty throne. Well, this was troubling because it raised the question of whose throne was mightier, Solomon's or the queen's. According to the Bible, Solomon's throne was made of ivory and gold. But what about hers? Of course, this debate of thrones is really a metaphor of God's rule on earth. A challenge to the seat of the Lord's anointed was an implicit challenge to the Lord himself. So if the queen could be brought to admit that Solomon's throne was greater, says the Quran, then she would implicitly accept that God was the one and only creator. In the end, the queen did come to Jerusalem. She came with a very great retinue, says 1 Kings, with camels bearing spices and very much gold and precious stones. And when she finally met Solomon, the queen reportedly exclaimed, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has set you on the throne of Israel." Alas, under the veneer of Solomon's wealth and prosperity, all was not well. As Solomon grew old, says the Bible, the northern tribes grew increasingly restless. As we've seen, the source of that unrest had been brewing for quite some time. Rather than being part of a unified kingdom, the northern tribes always preferred the sense of an alliance that gave each tribe full autonomy. Many elders may also have been repelled by the pomp at Solomon's court and his Asian-style harem. They felt that the southern tribe of Judah had become a ruling elite at the expense of the hardworking, mostly agrarian north. Solomon's tax regimen and his policy of sending press gangs throughout the provinces to recruit forced labor must also have been a source of great discontent. These policies, they felt, ran counter to the egalitarian spirit that was Israel before the monarchy, just as the prophet Samuel had feared. The Deuteronomist scribes who edited these passages naturally blamed the collapse of Solomon's kingdom on the fact that when the king was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods. He supposedly built shrines to the pagan gods of Ammon and Moab to please his wives. In the eyes of the Deuteronomist authors, this was, of course, sacrilege of the highest order. And so the kingdom of David and Solomon fell, says the Bible. How that came to pass and what happened next is the subject of my next lecture.
That was a pretty good summary of all of the things that are going on in Solomon's kingdom. And like with King David, towards the end of life, it seems like there are a little more astray from God than they were in the beginning of their rule. Last week, we talked about, in the video, it talked about camels, and we've talked about them before. We've had some kind of fun about talking about camels in class. But I found this site where it showed some modern camels. And camels, of course, are not the main transportation anymore around Asian and African countries, but they're still kind of like we keep horses. We keep them and we use them for multiple purposes and also for pleasure. So the camels are quite interesting animals, but they've begun doing something called a festival each year where people come together with their camels and they have contests for the best dressed hair designs for the camels. So they have shaved them into different patterns and they are pretty elaborate. They'll have camel races and various different kinds of activities going on. But if you take a look on the internet, just look up camel hairstyles, or camel wool hair, wool designs, it will show you some of these, and they're pretty elaborate, and you may find out a little more information. I thought that was just kind of a fun thing. So for next week, we are going to read about the temple building. And since we saw a good overview in this one, we might also forge ahead, but do a quick overview, read of 1 Kings chapters 5 through 8 about the building of the temple. And think back, way back into the book of Exodus, when Moses was given instructions on how to build the tabernacle to house the Ark of the Covenant and the building of the Ark of the Covenant, and see if you see any similarities and just things that might be in common in the rules and procedures for developing this new temple. And then besides that, if you have time, please read Psalm 72. It was a psalm written by King Solomon, and we heard about all of his many psalms and proverbs and songs that he wrote. For our closing today, I'm still kind of in the Christmas spirit, and I came across this poem by Ursula Vantrip, and written in around 2000 AD, not BCE, but AD, and it's titled BC AD. When you think of before Christ and after the date of the birth of Christ, which is the way we used to say things was AD and BC. Now we say that BCE and AD, as BCE and CE, before current era and current era. But she wrote this emphasizing before and after. This was the moment when before turned into after, and the future's uninvented timekeepers presented arms. This was the moment when nothing happened. Only dull peace sprawled boringly over the earth. This was the moment when even energetic Romans could find nothing better to do than counting heads in remote provinces. And this was the moment when a few farm workers and 3 members of an obscure Persian sect walked haphazardly by starlit straight into the kingdom of heaven. I just really loved the references in this poem to the birth of Jesus and the ordinary times of the people. I hope you enjoyed it as well. And our chuckle for today, even before Sinatra, before Johnny Mathis, and before Elvis, there was King Solomon singing his song. Can you imagine Israel's Got Talent? And it's good to be a king.